Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring how data influences our decision-making. On a daily basis, we're bombarded with information. Some of it well-intentioned, some of it deliberately misleading. Whether it's figures about COVID, claims in advertisement, statistics in sports, data in a work context, or facts we're being told by our friends, we all have to compute information to understand the world around us. But how can we make sense of what's being presented to us to allow us to take better decisions and avoid human risk? That's where my guest, Tim Harford, can help us. He goes by the pseudonym of the undercover economist, and he's a prolific broadcaster and writer. You may well have come across his columns in the Financial Times, heard one of his many podcasts and radio programs, or read one of his books. If so, you'll know that Tim has a sharp mind, an ability to share great stories and make complicated things seem simple. The perfect guide, then, for helping us through the complexities of the world we live in. And it's those complexities that make Tim's latest book, The Data Detective if you're in the US or Canada, or How to Make the World Add Up if you're elsewhere, so useful. In it, he provides 10 rules for thinking differently about numbers. But don't worry if you're not mathematically minded. These aren't complex calculations. The numbers Tim is talking about are the ones that we all come across on a daily basis. In his book, he sets out 10 strategies for using statistics to erase our biases and replace them with new ideas that use virtues like patience, curiosity, and good sense to better understand ourselves and the world. In our discussion, we talk about Tim's radio programs and podcasts, links to all of those in the show notes, starting with the brilliant and highly recommended BBC series, How to Vaccinate the World. We then move on to the subject of his book. If you've heard Tim before, you'll know you're in for a treat. If you haven't heard Tim before, then you're in for a treat. There's an art to making complex things easier to understand, and Tim is a master of it. So please enjoy my discussion with Tim Harford on using data to make smarter decisions. Tim, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks very much. Great to be on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And before we get into your book, I wanted to just sort of explore a little bit around what drives you. And I know you call yourself the undercover economist. But if I had to give you a title, I think I'd call you sort of explainer-in-chief, because it seems to me that your key sort of success and driver is really understanding the world and then helping others to understand it.
Yeah, well, I'm very flattered. I think explainer-in-chief implies that I'm in charge of the other explainers, which sadly is not the case. But yeah, I'm very interested in the world, and I'm very interested in geeky ideas about the world. So I'm interested in all sorts of social sciences, in behavioral economics, in psychology, sociology, all the data stuff. I'm interested in technology, and the view that I tend to take is if I'm interested in it, then other people will probably be interested in it too. And so my job is to find interesting things and then tell people about them.
And one of the things that you've been really good at telling people about recently is COVID, and in particular vaccination. And you've got a fabulous podcast that I really want to highlight to listeners called How to Vaccinate the World. It's a very simple title that goes into a very complex problem. And I'm intrigued by sort of how you approach that and how you think about that, because that is a massive topic. It's highly controversial. It's critical to all of us. And yet what you manage to do is to distill it down into answering the questions that we all have. And I think it's a lovely example of how you think, which is take something complex that we all know we ought to know more about, but don't often know where to start.
Yeah, there's been a sort of 1-2 punch, my Radio 4 programs on COVID. So first of all, we have More or Less, which has been running, it feels like it's been running almost continually since the beginning of the first lockdown, although that's not quite true. But we've been trying to understand the statistics behind COVID, and that program involves some quite detailed investigative reporting and trying to figure out what the government is doing when it sets itself targets for test results. And that was all, it felt really important, and it felt like we were at the heart of the story. It was also all quite depressing. And the great thing about How to Vaccinate the World is that we've been able to pick up this much more encouraging piece of news from late November and just try and address people's questions, including the questions we have and the questions that our listeners send us weekly since then. So as we speak now, it's the latest February. We're just preparing episode 16. The total run of the series is probably going to be about 20 or so, something like that. There will be a point where we just say, okay, we've understood this. But the great thing about How to Vaccinate the World is you can just phone up really interesting people with deep expertise, the vaccinologists and the epidemiologists and the behavioral scientists and the virologists and people who've made their own vaccines and people who study vaccination trials and people who study vaccination manufacturing, all of this stuff. You just get them around the table virtually. Obviously, we're all in our own basements. Get them around the table and ask them questions and listen to what they say. It's really very simple. It's been out of my comfort zone because a lot of the stuff that I do is quite scripted, quite researched. Whereas here, I'm just asking them questions and listening to the answers. But it has been fascinating. And as with any important subject, there's so many different angles to explore.
And I think that part of the joy of the show is you're approaching a topic that on the face of it, we sort of feel like we ought to know more about. And you're asking some very, very simple questions in a way that's comprehensible to the man and the woman in the street of some people that really are experts and trying to sort of distill this down into things that are useful for us to know. But it starts from a premise of this is complicated, this is challenging, this is difficult. And we're going to try and break this down for you. And I love that because I think the world is complicated nowadays. And sometimes we're overwhelmed and struggle a little bit to make sense of it. And I love the fact that your start point is, I don't expect you to know anything about this. This is not for experts. This is for the person in the street to really get a handle on something that's really important to them.
Yeah, one of the interesting things has been that at the beginning, I didn't know anything about any of these vaccines. I knew there were some different vaccines, but things like, there's an mRNA vaccine and there's an adenovirus vaccine. Like, what is that? I mean, what does all that mean? And asking these questions, I feel I've learned, and I hope that our listeners have learned along with me. But encouragingly, I think the experts have also learned. That one of the fun things has been quite early on, the answer to a lot of the questions was, well, we don't know yet. And as the months have gone past, there's still a lot of stuff we don't know, but there's a lot of stuff that we do know. And that's encouraging, the idea that you can see scientific knowledge progressing in real time. And you can have people who are at a certain point willing to say, I don't know. And then 3 months later are equally willing to say, well, now I do know. Because we got the data, because we found out. That's and the main story is that this stuff is going to save a lot of people's lives. And it's going to allow us to reopen economies and restore people's freedoms. And that's the most important thing. But it's also an amazing insight into how science and medicine and statistics all work.
And the one feature of the show that I find really interesting is, and I'll get the name wrong, but you'll know what I'm talking about, is that sort of what the producer didn't understand piece. So for listeners that haven't heard this, you do a follow-up piece, talk about something in the last show that your producer didn't understand. It's a beautifully framed device that sort of says, here's a very basic question. Here's a frame in which you can ask that question. And in one of the episodes, I think some listeners wrote in and sort of said they felt that was patronizing. And I thought it was a lovely example of how actually, it's perfectly okay to ask simple questions. And many of the reasons I think that we often sort of let things happen around us is that we're a bit scared to ask those simple questions for fear of looking stupid. And I love the fact that you created this vehicle to be able to do that without it being embarrassing. And yet, even having created that, and there were people looking at it saying, this is a bit patronizing. And I thought it was a lovely device that you'd built that, again, just facilitated asking simple questions.
I think the reason that people found that worrying, of course, we didn't realize this, but people assume I'm in charge of the program. Whereas, in fact, Richard Varden, the editor, is in charge of the program. And so people felt that I was bullying the staff. Whereas, in fact, we were sort of joking about the fact that the most powerful person, the guy who's sort of in charge of everyone, who gets to say whether we live or die, he's the one asking the dumb questions. So, yeah, I think if people had a different understanding of the power dynamic, then they might have objected less. But I think they felt that poor Richard was being bullied. Which, if they knew Richard, they'd know that that's most unlikely. He's perfectly capable of standing up for himself.
And the other podcast of yours that I wanted to quickly refer to is Cautionary Tales, which I know is due back very soon. Can you just tell those people that haven't listened to it before what they can expect?
Cautionary Tales is a storytelling podcast about true stories of things going terribly, terribly wrong, on the principle that if you study other people's mistakes, then you're less likely to make the mistakes yourself. So in each of these stories, there's a section where I break out the geekiness and I explain some psychological study or some theory in safety engineering or sociology or whatever, which helps to explain why this thing went wrong. And some of them are absolutely tragic. Some of them are very funny. Some of them are a little bit of both. And occasionally, just occasionally, there's a heroic rescue and things turn out fine at the end. You don't want too many of those, but you want a few. So that's what the program's all about. And what's fun for me is that we've got brilliantly composed and mixed music. We have really serious actors working to portray these events. And yet at the middle of it all, I still get to just talk about nerdy social science papers. So the new season of Cautionary Tales, it starts on, or possibly started, depending on when you're listening to this, on the 26th of February, and it runs for 14 episodes. And the first episode is all about a speech that went wrong and a speech that went right, and it features Jeffrey Wright playing Martin Luther King. Jeffrey Wright, Game of Thrones, James Bond movies. I mean, he's an amazing actor, and it's spine-tingling to hear him playing Martin Luther King. And episode 2 is all about how Florence Nightingale and her geek army declared war on death, armed with pie charts. And Florence Nightingale is played by Helena Bonham Carter, who is Florence Nightingale's distant cousin, actually. Her great-great-great-great-grandmother was Florence Nightingale's aunt. So it's amazing. And I did not think I would be writing scripts for people such as Jeffrey Wright and Helena Bonham Carter. So Cautionary Tales, tune in.
Fantastic. And Cautionary Tales, I think it's a good example of I think the way that you communicate with people. You're very strong on stories and telling stories. And that comes through in the book. That comes through in the way you talk about things. You find things that resonate with people, perhaps to surprise them, things they may have already known about, shining a different light on it, or maybe highlighting things that they've never heard of before. But this element of starting with a story seems to be, it's very powerful, and it's a key component of how you communicate.
Well, there are two reasons for that. One is that people like stories and they remember stories, and so it's a good way to communicate. The other thing is it's actually really difficult to tell good stories while also trying to stick to the social science point. And I find it a really enjoyable discipline. Now, that's when I lose myself in the writing, when I'm trying to do that. So I don't think I always succeed, but I love trying. And when I feel I have succeeded, I feel very proud of it. So that's, there's the production side. That's why I like to do the stories. And I think people like to listen to them as well.
And talking of writing, that brings us beautifully onto the book, which as ever with your writing, thoroughly enjoyed. And I thoroughly enjoyed it because I found myself so swept up in lots of points that sort of, as you often do, help me make sense of the world. But it felt like a sort of Bible for navigating the world around me. How to make better sense of the things that are happening. Was that the sort of key driver of writing it?
Yes, to help people make sense of the book, we should probably give people the title, which is not a straightforward thing because it varies. So the book in the US and Canada is called The Data Detective and came out at the beginning of February. And the rest of the world, including the UK, Ireland, South Africa, Australia, etc., the rest of the world, the book is called How to Make the World Add Up, and it came out in September 2020. But it's very different titles, exactly the same book. And yes, a friend of mine, the stand-up mathematician Matt Parker, who would be a very interesting interviewee for Human Risk, because he writes all about mathematical mistakes leading to things go wrong. Matt Parker said, so this is a book, you've written a book to help people think about statistics. And I thought about it and I said, no, actually, I've written a book to help people think about the world. I want to just help people think clearly, full stop. But a lot of the ways in which we need to think about the world involves statistics. There's a lot of stuff you can't understand or can't hope to understand about the world without good data, without good statistics. And so thinking clearly about the world beyond your personal horizons involves thinking clearly about statistics. And that's what I'm trying to do. Help people be smarter about the numbers, but also help them be smarter about their own filters and biases and these things that could lead them astray.
And as I was reading it, it really struck me that we are very dependent on numbers and data for making decisions. And it sounds like an obvious point, but I was sort of reflecting that there's some obvious times when people will present me with data, typically politicians trying to sell a particular line or advertisers, people. But there are even if you take a sort of average discussion, we're all using data points to persuade other people, and even the most ignorant person will either try and use false data, or they will even just try and rubbish your data. So it clearly forms part. We like this idea of having something to back up our ideas and thought processes, and we recognize the power of data. And yet, in some respects, we're not very good at analyzing it. And I'm fascinated by this challenge. So here's something that's really important. And yet, actually, many of the ways the human brain is conditioned makes us not very good at analyzing or understanding it.
Well, I think you've put your finger on one of the key problems here, which is that we are using data as a weapon in an argument. I want to sell toothpaste. I want you to vote for me. I want to prove that my mate in the pub is wrong about something. Therefore, I bring the data. And if that's how you look at it, you're immediately becoming stupider. You're not going to be able to think in a clear and impartial way about the strengths and weaknesses of the data and what it's really telling you, because you're too busy picking it up and beating someone else over the head with it. And so, one of the in a way, the final kind of overarching piece of advice in the book is to be curious about the data. But what that incorporates is largely a sense of treat the data as a way of helping you see the world. It's a window onto the world. It's a tool like a telescope, rather than some kind of weapon, some sort of prop in a political argument. So if that's how you're looking at it, if you're looking at it as a weapon, there's no way you're going to be able to see the strengths and weaknesses of it.
One of the things I thought was fascinating was you talk about, one of the rules focuses on misinformation. And I wanted to just sort of highlight that.
So the chapter Misinformation Can Be Beautiful is really a warning about the problems of, or the risks of data visualization. So there's a very nice book by David McCandless called Information is Beautiful. And there are other books by Edward Tufte, for example. I think there's one, Beautiful Explanations. And there's another one, Envisioning Information. So these great books about incredibly beautiful, compelling ways that you can convey data. One of the points I wanted to make in that chapter is you can portray data in an incredibly beautiful and compelling way, even if the data itself is junk. And so when I say misinformation can be beautiful, I don't mean misinformation is good. I mean, how would you tell the difference between information and misinformation? If you're judging it on the basis of aesthetics, you're in trouble. And of course, we do judge it on the basis of aesthetics. We're able to form an opinion of a graphic within, there's a study by Tufts, I think the Visual Information Lab, I forget the exact title of the centre there, but they're a group of researchers at Tufts. And they reckon that people form an opinion about a graph within 500 milliseconds, which is half a second. And you think about, and what kind of opinion would you form about a graph in half a second? You just sort of flashed it up. Obviously, you don't know what the graph says. You can't possibly know what the graph says in half a second. But you can say, oh, that's a mess, or shiny. And so we're very, very quickly forming these opinions of these graphics and often retweeting them, sharing them. Whereas, in fact, we need to treat them with the same respect and care and curiosity that we would treat data presented in any other format.
An obvious example that you highlight is social media, where this is, it almost encourages exactly the thing that's bad for us.
Yes. So social media, I don't want to blame social media for all our sins, just some of them. But so social media, one of the issues of social media is that makes it very easy to follow like-minded people and to get yourself into a bubble. Now, think about Fox News, think about the Daily Mail, the Guardian. It's possible to do that without social media. But still, social media lets you follow people, like-minded people, and get a very, very slanted view of what the typical person is thinking, what the typical news story says. Furthermore, and possibly worst, it encourages you to react very, very quickly. And some really interesting work by the psychologist Gordon Pennycook on just how a lot of misinformation and disinformation is spread by people who are just not in the mood to think about anything. So they're just in a hurry and they'll just retweet. It seems right, just retweet. It's called cognitive reflection. And the third issue with social media is it thrives on emotional engagement. And again, that is not unique to social media. Newspaper headlines are designed to make us feel emotionally engaged, joyful, afraid, anxious, vindicated, angry. These are why we pick up a newspaper or click on a headline. But social media particularly thrives on it. So you've got an information ecosystem that basically puts you in a bubble, encourages you to react very, very quickly to what you see, and makes you very emotional. That's not an environment that helps you think clearly. And the way I like to put it, if you really want to boil down the advice in the book to its simplest possible form, it's the 3 C's. So calm, context, and curiosity. Calm means just don't react in an emotional state. And that usually means noticing what your emotional state is when you see a social media headline or any other kind of headline. Once you've calmed down, you're in a better state to think clearly. And it might only take a couple of seconds for you to observe your emotional reaction, and then you can put it to one side. So the second C, so calm. Second C is context. So context means all kinds of things, but basically, is this a big number or a small number? Is it going up or down? Where did it come from? Who put it in front of me? What does it mean? What's being measured? Something's being counted or measured. I've probably leapt to some conclusion about what it is. Do I know a little bit more? Who's missing? Who's not being counted? These are the sort of questions that when you add them all up, they're the bulk of the book, the meat of the book, if you like, and they make up context. And then the final thing, which we've discussed briefly already, is curiosity, which is treating this information as a way of informing yourself about the world and answering your questions, rather than, I can use this to win an argument. So the 3 C's, calm, context, curiosity. Think about how they link together with social media. Well, social media doesn't encourage you to be calm, doesn't give you any context, and encourages emotional pile-ons and arguments rather than seeking fresh information. So, I'm not sure that we're doing it right, really.
It struck me that the lessons that you take people through is really the kind of thing that we ought to be teaching people at school. I put it in the bucket of critical thinking. And it seems to me that in many respects, we are taught some of these things. And I was thinking back to history as a good example of a sort of where you're taught to challenge different views, different perspectives. Looking at the rise of Hitler, you can see certain parallels with recent events in many respects. And so we're taught in isolated buckets, but nobody sort of sits you down and says, here's some things you ought to know. And as I was reading it through, I thought, this is something I have picked up through various aspects of my education. And yet, actually, isn't it something that we all need? We all ought to be equipped with when leaving school to be able to think in these terms.
Well, I'm cautious, having not been at school since 1992, I'm cautious of sitting here and opining about what schools should be teaching now, partly because they already teach a lot, and our teachers, I think, generally do a very good job, and our children are working extremely hard and covering a lot of ground. I'm always astonished at how much my children seem to be picking up at school. So I don't want to be that guy who's like, everything needs to change to incorporate right. my thing. But I think this stuff is very useful. I think it's interesting that you said that you'd learnt it in buckets. I think that actually might not be such a bad way to learn these ideas. I remember, for example, in an English class, one lesson where the teacher got us to bring in the newspapers that we read. So the first thing you get to see is, different kids in this class read, their parents take different newspapers. And then we did a sort of what the papers say. So we got some people at the front of the class, and they would read out newspaper headlines. It was all quite funny, and people were quite engaged. But you get to see, these different newspapers are reporting the same story in a very different way. Some is very simplistic, some of it's more complex, some of it's from a left-wing perspective or a right-wing perspective. Some people are supportive of this initiative, some people are against this initiative. It's a real lesson. So that was in English. But when I think about statistics, a lot of people say we should teach more statistics in school. I agree, again, with the cautionary note that, what's going to give. It's always easy to pile on more stuff. But I think there's a lot to be said for trying to teach statistical ideas in your economics class, your geography class, politics class, your physics class, your biology class. They can be combined in other ways. It sticks more and makes more sense when it's attached to something else. So I think there is definitely room both for critical thinking and for statistical thinking. I think it will often be most effective when it is combined with other subjects.
You make it very clear in the book that you're not expecting people to take your, what you'd slightly tongue-in-cheek, 10 Commandments, but you're not expecting people to do that every single time they come across a piece of information, because obviously the cognitive load that would impose would be quite significant. And that sort of led me to think of saying, one of the reasons that we don't necessarily challenge these things is because we're pre-programmed to make quick decisions. And so we know this if we take the sort of Kahneman system one, like we like to make quick decisions. So we're not naturally programmed to do some of the things that you're suggesting we ought to do. And I wondered where the balancing act is between going through a process, thinking carefully about what you're being told and the information that you're deciphering, but also not overloading the brain too much and spending your whole life pondering every single decision you take in great detail, which we can't do.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to those 3 C's. So I don't think it takes that long to take a moment to calm down, notice your emotional reaction. That is a habit you can get into very quickly. It doesn't take that long to get some kind of context, to ask yourself very simple questions like, what is the definition here being used when they're measuring the efficacy of the vaccine? What do they actually mean? Efficacy against what? Is it serious illness, death, any infection? What is it? What are they measuring? And curiosity. Well, that I think is a good habit of mind anyway. So I don't think I'm asking that much. But yeah, I'm not asking nothing. There is an effort involved. And so is there a shortcut? Well, there is one shortcut, which is to say to yourself, okay, this journalist or this social media post, this person who's telling me this stuff, are they following the 3 C's? Are they giving me context? Are they helping me be calm? And are they treating this fact as part of a process of explaining the world, of feeding curiosity and satisfying curiosity? Or are they treating it as an argument? So, yes, of course, a lot of what we do has to be outsourced to people we trust who come as the messengers. But I think it's worth asking if they're respecting these rules or not.
That's very interesting, because I wanted to pick up there's a lovely story about dazzle ships, which is this idea that came from the Second World War. Interesting. I first heard of that because of an OMD album, who you'll remember, many listeners won't. Was called, the album was called Dazzle Ships. And I said, what's all that about? And this is this idea that you can't hide a ship, so what we can do, the camouflage will make it difficult to see where it's going. And this idea of obfuscating data, I think, is fascinating. And you highlight, obviously, the way Donald Trump took a term fake news to literally mean things that aren't true. And we had alternative facts. So this idea of obfuscation, and it seems to be much more prevalent now. So if I can't come up with statistics that are any good to support my case, I'll just rubbish what the other people, or throw a whole load more noise out there to confuse people.
Yeah, so the dazzle ships, by the way, First World War dazzle ships, they're older than you think. That, I think, was a very interesting parallel between dazzle ships and data visualization. The thing about a dazzle ship is it attracts attention, but also it's quite hard to know what you're really looking at, what direction it's traveling, what angle, what speed. you've got bow waves painted on the stern and all this kind of stuff. And it's just that they're hard to describe, but it's effectively, imagine, Picasso or something, one of the cubists just decorating these ships. And then when you see it, you just don't know what you're looking at. And the parallel with data visualization is simply, well, a lot of data visualization is vivid and attracts attention, but then it ends up misdirecting. We don't really know what we're looking at. So I found that to be quite a fun metaphor. Donald Trump and fake news, I think, is something different and something very interesting. And it's not new. So this goes back to the 1950s. And this is the strategy of basically saying, I don't need to persuade you. All I need to do is persuade you to doubt the opposition. Steve Bannon, Trump's advisor in the early years of his presidency, said, look, the Democrats are not the opposition, the media are the opposition. And the way to deal with the media is to flood the zone with shit. So this is this idea of just, nothing's true, you can't believe anything, it's all fake news, it's all nonsense, you doubt anything, alternative facts, all that, and it just deflects the debate. So, do you remember how long we spent arguing over whether Donald Trump's inauguration was or was not better attended than Obama's inauguration? I mean, talk about distracting us from the issues. But people were just astonished that Trump's spokespeople could stand up and talk about alternative facts. And, so this is an amazing process of distraction and of doubt, a systematic sowing of doubt. Now, the reason I say this goes back to the 1950s is this is initially perfected by big tobacco to deal with the growing evidence that smoking cigarettes dramatically increases your chance of getting lung cancer. Well, that's a bit of a problem if you make cigarettes. So what do? Well, the tobacco industry realized they can't prove cigarettes are safe. They're just partly they're not safe, but also you're just never going to be able to assemble compelling evidence that they're safe. But what you can do is you can give people reason to doubt the fact that they're dangerous. And you can do that very, very cleverly. You start saying, well, it's very complex. Ongoing research, it's very important that we do the research. Scientists disagree. Causation, genetics, sick building syndromes, all that, so hard, so important. Let's do more research. And the reason that this strategy they called it manufacturing doubt. The reason it's so effective is partly the negative arguments are just powerful anyway. They stick in the mind. That's why we have negative campaigning. But partly also, if someone is smoking cigarettes, they're addicted to cigarettes, they enjoy cigarettes, you don't need to prove that cigarettes are safe. You just need to give them an out, a psychological out, some reason to believe they might not be dangerous, because that's what they really want. They don't want to believe that their habit is killing them. No one wants to believe that. So they're looking for any excuse. And doubt is perfectly satisfactory. And I think it was a very similar thing with Donald Trump. His supporters really, really wanted to believe in him, desperately fed up with the way politics was working in the United States. Trump says he's going to fix it. They really want to believe that. And so, again, you don't need to prove that he's the greatest president ever. You just need to give them some reason to doubt the critics. And that's what happened. We've seen it with big tobacco, climate change, negative campaigning. We saw it with Trump. It's not going away. And that's why, by the way, the very first chapter of the book, or the introduction to the book, is so determined to remind people that statistics can be used to tell the truth. There's more going on here than just, here's how to spot when people are lying with statistics. There's so many books on my bookshelf about how to tell when someone's lying to you with statistics. And they're good books. But collectively, I think they lead us into a potential error, which is the sense that lying with statistics is all people ever do. There is no truth out there. It's all misinformation. And at that point, I think we're lost. So we need to remember it's important to understand what's a lie, but it's more important to to understand what's true.
And it's very striking when you talk in those terms, because I was thinking back to How to Vaccinate the World and sort of what you're doing there, because that misinformation around vaccines is just the latest iteration of the processes you were just talking about. And I sort of was struck as you were talking that really is a good example of you putting this into practice, which is to sort of ask those questions and to step back and think. So I like the fact that in many respects, the book is sort of distilling the Harford technique, for want of a better phrase, of looking at stories. Is that a fair depiction?
Yeah, I mean, I would describe some of the stuff that's going around about vaccines as disinformation rather than misinformation. I think it's so the distinction between the two is that misinformation is unwitting error and disinformation is deliberate. And I think some of the anti-vaccination material I've seen is so willfully distorting of the evidence that you have to describe it as disinformation. And I mean, I asked one of our guests once, well, where's that coming? Is that foreign powers? Is that people trying to shill vitamins? Is that people with genuine religious or other ethical convictions? What is fueling all of this? And she basically said it's all of them. There's lots and lots of different reasons why people produce this anti-vaccination propaganda. But yeah, in How to Vaccinate the World, we're interested in this stuff. We're much, much more interested in how do these vaccines work? How do we know that they're safe, or how safe are they? How effective are they? How are they produced? All of this stuff, rather than just one debunking after another of some untrue post that's circulating on Facebook. There are people out there who do that very, very well, and it's a very important job. But I think it's also important not to allow ourselves to be giving undue attention to lies that are circulating and then make the mistake of never getting round to talking about what's true. I think, for instance, that's an error that people made in the debate over Brexit. A lot of fact checkers, a lot of people on the Remain side, a lot of journalists got themselves into a situation where the entire Brexit referendum ended up being just orbiting around something that somebody put on a bus that wasn't true. And I think whether you're for Leave or Remain, I think we can all now agree that the key issues that have emerged over the last 4 years are not really about how big that number on the bus should have been, how many £1 million a week it really should have been. That is not the debate we should have been having. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind. You can get yourself locked into fact-checking, or somebody said something untrue on the internet, and now I need to debunk it and rebut it. You can get yourself locked into that and never have time to actually consider what are the issues, what is what really should we be discussing. And
I thought that was a fascinating point, as you say. Somebody's put out a number that we need to talk about it, and we're drawn to that. And it was the power, as you point out, it's the power of the number. If you didn't have that number there, you could make some emotional argument. It wouldn't resonate with people. But it's the presence of a number that sort of gives it authenticity, or something people can hang their hat on. And I find that fascinating that when we, and there's a lovely infographic you've created in the book, which sort of, I think it was the number of words in the previous paragraph as an infographic.
Yeah.
And I love that because it's sort of, numbers seem to add credibility to things. Particularly, I think the actual numbers as opposed to the written numbers. It almost seems like we place a lot of store in that, and it's almost surprising that it has that impact on us.
Yes, it is strange. One of the examples that struck me recently was, a few months ago now, Matt Hancock, the UK Health Secretary, announcing that if everybody in the country lost £5 of weight, everyone who was overweight lost £5, then the NHS would save £100 million over 5 years. And, that's interesting that he decided to say that in the middle of this terrible pandemic. But anyway, he said it, and the Telegraph, I think, reported it. And lots of people emailed me and said, is it true? How can he say this? What's the causal basis for this? Is there a study, et cetera, all this stuff? I remember saying, well, hang on a minute. The first thing you should do is just ask yourself what's being said here. Get the context. So there's 67 million people in the country. He's talking about saving £100 million. That's £1.50 each. The maths behind that's not very difficult. So £1.50 each over 5 years. Okay, so that's 30 pence each. So what he's saying is if everyone who's overweight lost some weight, then the NHS would save 30 pence per person per year for 5 years. I mean, so what? I mean, who cares if it's true? Really, who cares where he got that number from? It's not an interesting claim. But nevertheless, it absorbed a lot of attention. So yeah, we need to be careful. Dazzle camouflage all over again.
And there's another bit in the book you talked about. You've become a sort of fact checker, if you like. People sort of turn to you and go, "Is this true?" And I find that sort of it's an interesting bit that because you spend a lot of time doing this and doing this in public, that people vest sort of credibility in it. And almost, if you wanted to abuse your position, I mean, you'd undermine your credibility in the long run, but you could do that. It's fascinating that you've become a sort of, far from it, I'll shift from explainer in chief to fact checker in chief in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. So for a long time, senior figures in Radio 4 would occasionally float this idea that I would sit in the corner of the Today programme studio during election campaigns. And then when a politician said something, they'd be able to turn to me. Michelle Hussein would turn to me and say, "Well, Tim, that thing that they just said, is that right or not?" And I kept pointing out, and I think eventually the idea went away. I kept pointing out, it's not possible to do that. You can't know enough about enough topics to live fact check this stuff. So, I mean, Full Fact, who are a great fact-checking organisation, they are trying to get on top of this with and doing live fact checks or live-ish fact checks of Question Time. The reason they're able to do that is A, there's a team of people, and B, they've got really, really good at searching their own library of fact checks. So most untrue things, or occasionally most true but seemingly dubious things that politicians say on Question Time, they've been said already. So these factoids go around again and again. So you just go into the archive, you pull out the fact checker from the archive, and you say, this is true, this is not true, this is sort of true, but you really need to understand some context. So they can do it, but it's hard. And what people don't understand about More or Less and how More or Less works, apart from the fact that there's a team of people working on it, is we've got time. Somebody says something on the Today programme at 8:10 in the morning, we've got 2 days to figure out whether it was true. And people sort of beat up the Today programme presenters for not instantly spotting the misinformation. But I think it's a hard job. One of the pieces of advice I give in the book, by the way, is that you should slow down. If you slow down both your own reaction to the news, but also arguably slow down your news consumption, so focus more on, say, weekly sources. I recommend the FT Weekend. It's a great newspaper and magazine. The Economist.
Can't think why, but
yeah. The Economist, The New Yorker. Take it on a weekly basis, and you're much more likely to be able to filter out a lot of the noise and focus on the stories that are more important, but also the analysis of those stories is more likely to be accurate because the journalists will have had more time to get their facts straight.
It's fascinating really when I think about the concept of breaking news, because there seems to be, there is this thing that sort of says first with the news, and sort of the fact that we have these rolling news channels plays into a desire for, clearly people watch this stuff and being up to date. And I've done it. You sort of watch the rolling news and you're watching the same thing repeated times, slightly different, same story. You watch it for 2 hours, unless something's happened, you're kind of picking up the same. But we're sort of compelled towards that. We like this immediacy. And, that comes back, I think, to the way that we think. And actually that requirement to slow things down. It feels like we ought to be up to date, we ought to be taking decisions immediately, moving very, very quickly, because that's in keeping with the way the world seems to be running. And yet, as you point out, better decision-making comes if we allow ourselves a little bit of time. But that's very difficult to go against that natural intuition that we ought to be all-knowing, all-seeing now. And if it's there, we ought to be taking advantage of it.
I think it's worth also noting your own news consumption patterns and just being mindful of them. And what I have found is that I'm checking the numbers a lot more often, for example, when I'm feeling anxious. So, when there's the latest wave hit in the UK just after Christmas, I would be checking every day how many vaccinations today, how many cases today, any sign of a vaccination effect, any sign that lockdown's working. That's my own anxiety. And just observing that in me. Whereas I think when cases were slowly going up in October, just wasn't paying as much attention. They were quite low, things were moving quite slowly, and I would only check every week or so. And actually, I suspect only checking every week or so, going to have a better sense of what's going on. I mean, there are people on Twitter, there's some really good people on Twitter who will say stuff like, you need 5 days, to confirm a new trend because there's noise. And yet at the same time, they're posting every time the numbers come out. while at the same time going, and remember, you need 5 days of this to be sure. It's just, that's human nature. And I'm there every day looking. So that's just the way we are.
Because I was thinking it's analogous to people looking at their stock portfolios. If the markets are tumbling, they're checking how much they're losing. It's a classic loss aversion, looking at it. And if things are going up, you monitor it every so often. So I was just reflecting that that is what we do, and so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that that's how we react to the news as well.
Yeah. Although actually, I mean, maybe I'm going to contradict myself, but there is some evidence. It's called the ostrich effect. There is some evidence that people avoid checking their stock portfolios when they know stock markets are falling, and they look more often when stock markets are rising. So there's different things going on here. I mean, this is why I think it's interesting. There's a need to sort of scratch that anxiety itch. There's a sort of a need for good news rather than bad news. I mean, I suppose maybe I'm not contradicting myself because I'm talking about checking every day. Is it still falling? Is it still falling? Yeah, that's the equivalent of checking your stock portfolio every day. Is it still rising? Is it still rising? Is the good news sustained? But there's a lot of different reasons why we choose to consume information. But very often they are not about making decisions. We're consuming this information for some other reason, to satisfy an emotional need or an ability to talk plausibly at dinner parties, when, we have dinner parties again, which may be a while. So yeah, it is worth asking yourself, what is it, if I'm checking this information, what is it that I actually plan to do with it?
As you were talking, I was actually thinking it's fascinating because we talk about being bombarded with information, which is correct. If I walk out on the street here in London, I might, there'll be information all over the place, on the side of a bus, on posters. So to the extent when I'm on the street, but if I'm in the privacy of my own home, actually a lot of it is my choice of what to look at, where I look at. Now, I won't necessarily know what they're going to put through the channel, but I can choose not to switch on that channel. I can choose not to go on that website. And so to a certain extent, we have the gift ourselves, and yet we're not very good at using it.
No, I think we've allowed ourselves to be drawn into ecosystems of information without really thinking hard about why and whether that's what we want. So Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism, is excellent on this topic. He points out that really we've only had smartphones. So the iPhone was 2007. Smartphones have been fairly ubiquitous for about 10 years. And they've changed over time, more and more stuff on them. There's a similar sort of timescale for the social media sites. Twitter, I think, is 2008. Facebook's a little bit older. This is all quite new. Certainly I'm in my late 40s. It's all quite new for me. And it just came along and gradually but quickly just influences almost everything you do during the day and what you check and how you check it. And Cal, I think quite rightly says, we all need to take a step back and go, what is it that we're actually doing? Why do you have Facebook on your phone? Why do you have Twitter on your phone? Why do you have email on your phone? Why do you have a news app on your phone? Have you ever thought about whether that is what you actually want or not? And I think most people, if they took a step back and thought seriously about it, they would be a little bit more minimalist, and they might say, okay, actually, I do want email on my phone. I don't want Twitter. I'm happy to only use Twitter when I'm on my computer. I'm happy to only use Twitter on Friday afternoons. I'm happy to actually never use Twitter. But we don't have these conversations with ourselves. We fall into these habits without really questioning. And I suppose in a way, in How to Make the World Add Up, stroke the data detective, I am trying to get people to be mindful about the way they process information in all kinds of ways, whether it's the news sites you subscribe to, the frequency with which you check the news, or the questions you ask yourself once you see the claim, once you see the number. Just to say to yourself, why did I check this website? Where did this come from? What does it mean? How am I feeling? What am I going to do with this information? Once you are more thoughtful about it, more mindful about it, you're much more likely to think clearly and sensibly and make clear and sensible decisions too.
I think that, Tim, is a fantastic message to send out. We know from behavioral science we need to end on a high, and I think that was rather than worrying about the doom and gloom or the negativity, the positive note there of what we can do about this was great. Final question for me, and I'll put links to all of these things, including the excellent book and your columns and podcasts and the wealth of content that you put out there. What does the rest of the year look like for you? What's up next?
Well, I'm pondering whether to rewrite How to Make the World Add Up, stroke The Data Detective, as a children's book, trying to figure out whether for younger readers, sort of 10, 12 years old, whether that might be a good thing to do. Several people have suggested it might be. And I still have yet to finish the last 2 episodes of Cautionary Tales. So given that the season is about to start, I need to get on with that. So there's that. And then hopefully the vaccine will continue to roll out. And I think the second half of 2021 looks like being a lot better than the first half.
Fabulous. Well, listen, thank you. I know you're incredibly busy, so I hugely appreciate your time. And thank you so much for making the world a clearer and actually, frankly, more fun place. And every time I get an email from you or see an article that you've written, I always know I'm going to be enlightened and entertained. And I think that's a very important skill. So thank you for those things. And thank you above all for appearing on the podcast.
But thank you, Christian. It's been a pleasure.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Tim Harford for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Tim's writing and his audio work, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there, including the highly recommended How to Vaccinate the World podcast series. You can also find links to The Data Detective or How to Make the World Add Up in the show notes as well. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the podcasting platforms. If you like the show, please do take time to leave a 5-star rating. It really does help. I will be back very soon with another episode of this podcast. But in the meantime, if you need more human risk related content, visit human-risk.com. You'll find links there. I'll see you very soon for another episode of this show. But in the meantime, good luck with your decision making. Thanks for listening. And above all, stay safe.